to the Olympics coverage and the kind of the Olympics opening ceremony. I don't know who got an opportunity to watch that or to see that, but it's been all over a controversy about basically a kind of a presentation for the opening ceremony that either was or at least very similar to the Last Supper, a portrayal and kind of a mockery of that. They came out a few days after and said, oh, it's not about that, it's about a pagan holiday. And, you know, neither one is good. Either doing a mockery of Christ and his Last Supper or having a huge celebration of a pagan god, neither one is good. So in either case, not a great thing. But the way that it was presented is that they brought out just a bunch of, it was really a big transgender show, but they also had a guy up there with like his stuff hanging out of his shorts and little kids up there on the stage, and just really inappropriate regardless of what the meaning of it was for having kids up there especially. And so that started a whole thing about the Last Supper and why are all these things being mocked and all that. And I'll just tell you, the main reason that things are being mocked is because the world is not the church. I mean, it's just that simple. The world is not the church. The world is the world. And as long as the world is the world, it will mock the Lord. Jesus said that if they persecuted him, they'll persecute us. And that there will be mockers and scoffers that come, not only then, but in the last age. That is what people are going to do. And so what I want to do, though, is take the opportunity to look at this, not for the offense. You know, if you were offended, if you were angered by that or anything, if you were bothered by it, what I want to say is that there's also an opportunity for us to just talk about what the Last Supper really is, what it was about. And if it is significant, it is to be something that's like a kind of an honored, significant time in Christian history, well, then what's it all about anyways? What is the purpose of it? What happened there? What did Jesus do? And so that's what I want to get into. Exodus chapter 11, 1 through 13 is kind of the story of the really beginnings of the Last Supper. And this is in the Old Testament. So the Last Supper, we think about that as, well, Jesus ate with his disciples and he went to the cross. Well, it was on... The actual timing of it was on Passover. And so what is the Passover? Some of us know, some of us don't, but the Passover is literally going all the way back to the Old Testament when the Israelites were in Egypt and they were trying to get free from slavery and bondage. And they are trying to get out. Pharaoh keeps holding them back, and they've been in slavery for 400 years, and he keeps on restraining them, and God's calling them out into the wilderness, but he keeps pulling them back. And Pharaoh won't let him go. And so God sends a plague, and then another plague, and then another plague. And he sends 9 plagues, and he finally gets to the last and final plague where he's trying to bring judgment against Egypt for not setting his people free and for holding them as slaves. And the final one is that he was going to go through, and the angel of death was going to come through and was going to take out a bunch of Egyptians. And so it was going to take out their firstborn. And so what happened then is that the Israelites were told that if you would take the blood of a lamb and put it over your door and mark that out, then when the angel of death comes, it would see that and it would just move on. Well, this is pushing all the way forward and kind of foreshadowing Christ coming and his blood covering us as death would come for us. And so, but it's called the Passover because the angel would come and then pass over your house. Okay, so every year this is celebrated as the Passover, as that people would come and they would celebrate and remember that. Well, that's when the Last Supper was happening. It was happening at the Passover, and it was that's a key time because it's also looking at Jesus about to go to the cross. So that was, you know, the blood was put over the door. Jesus getting ready to go to the cross. He comes to Passover. He has dinner, and so here we are. That's where we're coming in at with this Last Supper meal. And out of Exodus, it really represented God's judgment against rebellion, his deliverance of his slaves and his people, victory and freedom from their slave masters, and that they were under slavery too, trust and faith in God as their deliverer, and it was foreshadowing the cross. And so, you know, one of the things that we think about when we think about the Last Supper, or we think about inviting people to church and these things, because this is one of the things that was being talked a lot about the last couple of weeks, was, you know, also some controversy over, well, isn't anybody welcome at God's table? I mean, anybody could come. Everybody should be invited. Everybody's welcome. And that's kind of true. It's true at the start, but it's not true at the end. And what I mean by that is that God does invite all, but not all who come will be received. Not all who come will be received. And where do I get that from? Well, there's two stories in the Bible that talk about invitations. One is in Luke, when he invited the disciples to the Last Supper. This was a very intimate time with just him and his disciples. There's only the 12 of them, plus Jesus, that were invited to that room. And so when you're talking about coming to an intimate place with Jesus and actually have that time with him to learn from him and to sit at his feet and to do that, it isn't for everybody. It's for people that have surrendered their life and people that have given their heart over to him and said, you know what, I'm surrendering. Every person that was in that room had given up their former life in order to follow him. That's why they were invited to the room. There's another story. Jesus used the parable of a banquet. And in the banquet, everyone's invited, and a lot of people don't want to come because they're too busy. I'm too busy. I've got this going on and that going on. And so then the king gets angry, and he says, you know what, send everybody out into the highways and the byways and the bushes and just bring anyone in that will come. Well, that's an example that really, literally, that God's table, his banquet, is for everyone. Only if you read the rest of the story, one of the guys gets thrown out of the party because he won't put on the robe of the home. He wants to wear his own clothes. So again, everyone is invited. Not everyone is received. The gospel is exclusive. It's an exclusive story. It's an exclusive story that those who come and serve Christ, that lay their life down in order to receive his, are the ones that will be redeemed. They're the ones that will be invited into the banquet. They're the ones that will spend eternity with him in heaven. It's not that we all come as we are and stay as we are. We come as we are and surrender who we are in order to receive who he wants us to be and what he wants to give us through Christ. And so there is a difference there. But this Last Supper is that intimate time where Jesus is inviting people to come up and to spend time with him. And it requires accepting him, and it requires a surrender of our life. It required a surrender of their life. They were only there because they'd given up their businesses. They'd given up we had doctors and fishermen and tax collectors and all these. They'd given everything up in order to follow him, their old identities, their old ways. One of the key purposes of the Last Supper was to introduce a new covenant. We had the old covenant, is the Old Testament, and that was the law. You got to do everything right. And if you don't do everything right, then that's it for you. Everything, you have not just the 10 commandments, but they had over 600 commandments at this point that people were trying to follow. And so Jesus comes along, and it says here in Luke 22, he took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, to his disciples, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So here he is initiating this new covenant, a new covenant that's not based on our works, but he's saying, I'm dying for you, I'm giving my life for you. And so we're entering a new covenant, and we're exiting the old one. We're moving into something new. And so this is a transition that's happening at the Last Supper. As he's getting ready to go to the cross, he's explaining this to him and talking to him about it. Exodus 20 is where the Old Testament kind of introduces the 10 Commandments, and we get into these are the laws of God and things that you have to follow. Luke 22 is when we get into this new covenant. And the difference is that the old covenant was really about what we need to do for God. I need to work hard, I need to do this, I need to accomplish all these things, I need to keep all the rules, keep all the laws. The new covenant really emphasizes what God has done for us, is that he died for us, that he rose again, not to free us from any responsibility to serve. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. So God is still interested in his ways. He's still interested in his commandments. He's still interested in us doing things his way because he's God and he knows the right way. But now it comes through love and through grace and him empowering us to do that and doing it relationally. The new covenant is really a covenant of grace, but it's also a covenant of humility in that it takes a willingness to surrender in order to receive it and to walk it out. Here's some people that were at the table with Jesus. And it's not just humility to be there, but also humility when we look out at the world around us. In James chapter 4, 6 or 7, it says, he gives us more grace. That is why he says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So you can see it combines both grace and humility here, and that if we want God to be working on our behalf, and we want to receive his grace, we also have to submit ourselves to him and that we have to be humble. So there's a combination that's happening here. At the table, Jesus invites these people, and there's Peter who denied him. These are all sitting at the table. So when Jesus is breaking bread and passing it out and talking about his new covenant, he's literally sitting in a room with people that he knows. Peter's going to deny him. He knows that Judas is going to betray him. He knows Thomas is going to doubt him because Thomas is a doubter. I mean, he's looking at the people in the room, and you're like, hey, this is my crew. This is who I'm going to roll with. And every single one of these people are going to leave me. Like, he already knows that. Because he talks about when they strike the sheep, when they strike the shepherd, that the sheep will scatter. And he tells them that ahead of time. And he's looking around saying, I see all of you guys. So here's the thing, is that we get a seat at the table through grace and by receiving God's grace. But then we have to stay in a place of grace, because it's easy as Christians, as believers, to sit there and then eventually go, well, look at all the people that aren't at the table. Because they mock God, and because they do this, and because they do that. But look at me. I'm at the table because I was smart enough to receive his grace. I'm good enough to follow him now. I know I wasn't that way, but he's changed me. Now look who I am, and I'm so great. And our ego starts to build up, and we start to forget where we came from. And the fact that the only reason we're at this table is because of his grace. Not just his grace that got us there, but his grace that keeps us there. If you think about your own life, have you ever denied Jesus? Have you ever denied him? Have you ever just denied him verbally? Have you ever denied him in this? He said, you know what? Don't worry about what you'll eat or drink or what you'll wear, because your heavenly Father already knows that you'll need it. Okay. I trust you, Lord. I have faith in you. And then when your money gets tight, did you worry? Okay, because that is denying Jesus. It's denying his word. It's denying his truth. He said that he would be there and you don't need to worry. But then you said, well, forget that. I'm going to take this on myself and worry about it. That is a denial of the relationship, of the trust, of the word that he gave you. You're saying, I don't want to. So it's easy to look at other people and to judge and to say, you know what you're doing is so wrong and I wouldn't do that. And yet, in different ways, we are all doing some of these things. To betray him, to doubt, Thomas the doubter. I mean, to do all these things, to scatter and to run. I'm sure that you've had opportunities to speak up, to share your testimony, to share your faith, or God's prompted you to pray for someone, and you were about to do it, and then you're like, oh, I don't know, it makes me too nervous. That's just to pray for someone. In a church. Sometimes we walk away from it in the church. God says, pray for that person standing over there by the snacks, and you're like, oh, I don't know, that'd be awkward. Let alone in the world. When you're standing next to somebody at a coffee shop and God says, you know what, ask that person something in prayer. You're like, whoa, I don't know. They're just here for a latte. And we back up. So look at Peter, who denied Jesus, while there's soldiers around and people dragging Jesus off and beating him and whipping him. I mean, that's a whole other level of denial that he was facing, and a whole different level of pressure and stress. And so we face some of these things, but these are the people at the table, and Jesus knows what they're going to do. He knows what we're going to do. And so we sit at the table of the Lord spiritually, and we live our lives at this table with the Lord. That we have intimacy with Jesus, him talking to us, speaking to us, his Holy Spirit working in us. And yet all the while we could say, I know where I was, and thank God for where I am. But you know what? God also knows where we're going. And I'll just tell you that you're all amazing, but the future isn't all pretty. So you still are going to have some struggles. You still are going to have trouble. You're still going to have some doubts. You're still going to have some bad days. You're still going to have some times when you look back and go, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. And he already knows. And yet he's walking with you and he's caring for you. And so there's a humility required, not just to get to the table, but there's humility required to stay at the table. And continue to trust and to depend on him. Mark 14, 18 to 19, Jesus exposes at this table that there's human evil and weakness all around him. Even in the most intimate place. You take the whole world and you're going to whittle it down all the way to these are the only 12 that can be in this room with me. And even in there's evil and weakness, because that's the human heart. That's where our nature is. That's where we come from. Mark 14, he says, while they were reclining at the table, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. Now listen to this sentence, okay, because this is where it's interesting. They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, surely you don't mean me. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? If I'm in the car and we get some pizza, we're driving around, we're all eating pizza in the car, we're driving down the road, or some hamburgers or something, and we're on the go, and my wife gets a piece and she's going to eat it, and she goes, "Hey, whose hair's on this pizza?" I don't even think about it because I know it's not mine, right? I have complete confidence. There's no sign of like weakness in that. Like, nope, not mine. Look around. Yet when Jesus says someone's going to betray me, if these guys all knew that their heart was all in, that they were for it, there was nothing to fear, they'd have been like, "Well, who's that? It's not me." But one by one, each one of them said to him, "Is it me? Is that my hair? Am I walking away?" Which tells you what about them? Every single person at the table was struggling with doubt, was struggling with some kind of weakness, with some kind of betrayal. Every person in the most intimate place was still struggling. Okay, now let's take this out of here and let's take it back to the Olympics for just a second. Okay, there's people, whether it was a mockery of the Last Supper or whether it was a table that was about a pagan god, either one, take your pick. There's people who don't believe in Jesus, that don't follow Jesus, that have doubts, that mock the idea of someone dying, spending 3 days in a tomb, and rising again to save the world. Yeah, if I wasn't a Christian, I would also mock this idea. It doesn't make sense. Other than a miracle happening that we've experienced. But if they haven't experienced it yet, how are they going to walk in that and know that and to be able to have that confidence when we who are at the table sometimes lack confidence? Lord, is that me? Am I blowing it? Did I do enough? Are you sure? Do I have enough faith for that? Why isn't this changing? And we're the ones that are at the table. Mark 14, 22 to 23. This is kind of a rephrasing of the same passage, but it has a little bit different ending that I want to share. It says, "While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take it, this is my body.'" So he knows all these people's weakness. He's still breaking his body and giving it to them. And this is where I think it's important. The Last Supper, if we're going to honor it and say this is a significant time, a significant moment, the best way to honor it is to learn from it. Not just to honor it as a religious thing that, well, yeah, there's a great, painting of it, and so we honor that. But to honor what Jesus was modeling and teaching, because that's what he wants us to model and to teach and to live out. And so here he is. He got these people that he knows are going to betray him. He knows that they're going to go out on him. He breaks his body with the bread, and he gives it out. Said, "Take it." To who? To people that he knew were not going to live up to the bar. He still offered himself to them. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. He gives his blood out. He says, "You know what? Here, drink from this. Eat from the body." And every single person at the table received it. What does that tell you? It tells you that as we try to follow Christ and model Christ, that we are called to give our lives out to people who we look at and we already know they're not going to live up to this. They're not going to appreciate this. They might let me down. They might offend me. They might hurt me. They may mock me. They may do this, but yet we still lay it down because Jesus was sitting here at the table and he still laid it down even with the most intimate people. Matthew 5, 44 to 45. This is just an example flashing back that Jesus was literally living what he preached. But I say to you, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Pray for those who hurt you. If you do this, you will be true children of our Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the good people and on the evil people. He sends his rain on those who do right and to those who do wrong. Is that he's literally living out the message that he's preaching. He preached this out in the fields to people, and now he's got an opportunity at the table to share with and to care for those people that are about to hurt him emotionally, about to hurt him in relationship, and he's giving to them, he's caring for them. But we have that opportunity around us every day. Do I appreciate being mocked? No. Do I appreciate being ridiculed? No. Do I appreciate being persecuted? No. But the gospel isn't about me. The gospel is about Jesus, and this is how Jesus lived. And so if I want to model the gospel and live the gospel and walk in the heart of the gospel and honor the Last Supper and honor Jesus, then the best way to do it is for me to say, what is his heart and how do I do that? How do I live this? How do I walk it out? And he comes out of there, and then he heads to the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is where he's going to go to the garden and pray. And I want to do this after piece because it shows what the Last Supper was. He wasn't just, hey, let's have dinner, and then, all right, we'll see you guys next week. This was dinner, garden, death. That was the track he was on. And yet he's continuing in this track to stop and to love and to serve and to care and to teach and to give his life for others. Mark 14, 32 to 35. This is where he prays and he says, Father, he says, if it's not my will, but yours be done. Because he's talking about going to the cross. And he's like, man, if there's any other way, can we try something different than this hard path? And then he says, you know what, but not my will, but yours be done. And he gives up his will. He surrenders. This is how the new covenant works, is that if we want to follow God's way, we're going to face trouble, difficulty, persecution. You could face mockery. You could face loss of relationships. You could face all kinds of things. You might face loss of a job. Who knows? But you're going to face loss. At the very least, loss of some of your own desires, some of your own ways and your own will. And yet we come to the same place as Jesus. He goes through this supper, and he comes out of that, and he says, you know what, not my will, but yours be done. We have to be willing to lay our will down, the things that we want. He encouraged his friends to pray. He turns to them, and he says, hey, pray. I'm praying for you. You should also pray. Of course, they go to sleep instead. But he's trying to encourage them to pray and to get up. Now, here's the thing. Peter, when the actual guards came to get Jesus to take him off to the cross, Peter reaches out with his sword and cuts off a guy's ear. And do you know what Jesus did? He put it back on. Heals his ear, puts it back on. Well, what does that have to do with us? Well, Peter was focused on a political, governmental, earthly kingdom. And when he thought that Jesus was being threatened, he went to action to fight for that. And Jesus stops him and says, no, I'm putting this ear back on this guy. Like a Mr. Potato Head. We'll put it back on. Good, we're set. And now, this isn't what my kingdom's about. Okay? So, in all of that, I couldn't imagine, bringing it back to modern day times, Jesus comes out of the Last Supper. Jesus goes into the garden. People are trying to arrest him. Peter's fighting for this physical world. Jesus is putting ears back on. I can't imagine that if Jesus was here and the world was mocking his sacrifice, mocking his love, mocking his care, that his response would be to light people up on social media. I couldn't see it. I find nothing so far in the Last Supper or in after the Last Supper that would show that he would ever do that. That would be his heart. Well, would he speak the truth? Yes, but there's a difference. I don't see him coming out into going back. He didn't come out of the Last Supper and see a bunch of people that were going to mock him and heard him start blasting them, getting into arguments. He didn't need to because the truth is the truth. And so he could just walk it out and live it and let it speak for itself. He could let it show. He didn't need to be in the argument. He didn't need to be in the fight. Doesn't mean that he never spoke truth. He did. But when he spoke it, he spoke truth, and he spoke it in love. He spoke it in care. And you know what? He was still mocked and ridiculed. It doesn't mean you won't be mocked or ridiculed or put down or judged. You will. The truth is offensive by nature because in our heart, we all like to chase after our own lies. And the truth keeps us from that. But Jesus walks these things out. The disciples were responding with aggression and self-defense, and then they got afraid when God's not coming to our rescue. We're afraid. We're going to run. We're going to hide. Then they all scattered. But meanwhile, Jesus is saying, do you know what? This is about something bigger. John 18. This is when Jesus is on trial. And this gives you a reasoning for why did he stop Peter? Why did he put the ear back on? Why did he do things this way? It says, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. He said, you know what, if this was my kingdom, I would get in all of these political battles. I'd get in all these worldly battles. I'd get into all this. But you know what, this isn't my kingdom. My kingdom is bigger than this. My kingdom is outside of this. Does that mean that you shouldn't vote? No. Doesn't mean that. We should take every responsibility. The Bible says, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. If you have something good that you can do, you should do it. But they were caught up and preoccupied with this world's kingdom. And Jesus was not getting distracted by that. He was continuing to move forward and say, no, this is my kingdom. Because here's the thing. If we chase offense, you will never stop chasing offense. Because as soon as the Olympics is over, Starbucks is not going to have a Christmas tree on their mug this year. And then what? Something's going to happen that says, do you know what? I'm not being honored. Of course you're not being honored. You're a Christian in a pagan world. Your values do not run this world. Your worldview is not accepted by a majority of the people in this country, in your workplace, in your school. And so the idea that I should be able to express my ideas and my thoughts and people are not going to be against me is false. It's just false. And if you live with that expectation, you'll be constantly hurt, constantly offended, constantly let down, because why isn't everybody getting excited because of what I think and what I believe? Because they don't. This culture today isn't just anti-God, it's anti-science. It's anti-biology. It's anti-family. It's anti-anything that has to do with normal structure. It's a deconstructionist society. It's pulling down everything that showed any structure, because they want to rebuild everything from the ground up. And so if you think that you're going to be able to make it through life without being offended or being hurt or being persecuted, it's just not going to happen for any of us. And if we accept what Jesus said, which is that if they persecuted him, they'll persecute us, then we said, you know what? It's going to rain. I used to live in Oregon, and it rained every day. Every day. Even on the days that didn't rain, just the memory of the rain was still hitting you in the head. It always rained. And you know what? You get used to it. And then you wear different clothes. You don't put as much hairspray in your hair because you know it's going to get washed out the second you step out. You get an umbrella. You start to live accordingly. And then all of a sudden you adjust. When I moved to Bend, it's freezing cold there. It would be 10 degrees, and then with wind chill, it'd be below zero, and we're out there freezing to death. When I moved there, I tried to take Jackson to school. I'm going down the street, and I'm riding a bike, and he's walking beside me, and we're cruising. I got about halfway there, and I literally, as I'm pedaling, my legs just started stopping. And I'm just stopping. My whole body's freezing. And my chest is frozen. And my legs are frozen. My face is frozen. My lips are frozen. And I can't even move. But by the time we moved from there, our whole furniture stores, multiple stores and warehouses were all getting flooded with snow. We were getting about a foot an hour. And I was out there in a pair of jeans with a snowblower and no shirt, just snow blowing. That was 5 years in. I'm just like, I got no shirt on, I'm just out snow blowing. Why? Because I realized, my body realized, I realized this is what I live in. And we can adjust. Okay? We live in a culture and in a world that does not accept or believe what we believe by the vast majority. We live in darkness. The reason that we're called a light is because we live in darkness. So if we can accept that, doesn't mean accept that things should be bad, but accept that as a reality. It allows us to embrace the call that God has for us, which is to be a light, which is to be salt, which is to speak truth. Well, why does someone need to speak truth? Because there's a lot of lies. Like when we accept that there's a difference, instead of being offended by that, we can say, you know, there is a difference and I need to speak life to it. Going on Luke 23, 26 to 38. This is where Jesus is on the cross. So, well, how long should we love people? How long should we suffer and just continue to try to care and love? Well, here's Jesus' example. I'm not telling you what to do, but here's Jesus' example. It says he's hanging on the cross with criminals, one on the right, one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. They divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching. The rulers sneered at him. And they said, he saved others, let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one. And the soldiers came up and they mocked him. He's literally been whipped. He's unrecognizable, the Bible talks about. You can't even tell who he is. He's hanging on a cross. He's bleeding out. All of his disciples have left him. He's got nothing left to give. And they're still gambling for his clothes, mocking him, talking smack to him up there. He's up there dying. And his words, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Do you know how hard it was for him to get those words out? Not just emotionally, spiritually, mentally, but physically. The way that a cross works, you hang there and it pulls your ribs up and it pulls your lungs up and your legs are giving out and you literally can't breathe or speak because you can't get any volume into your chest. So for him to do the work with the pain and the suffering and the near death and all that, to get himself up enough, to get enough breath, to say these words at enough audible projection that someone there could hear them and record them, means it wasn't just a flippant forgiveness, like, Lord, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. It's that he was crying out, regardless of the pain, the suffering, everything else, that he thought it worthwhile to put himself through all of this to get these words out and to pray for those people. What about us? If we're being mocked in this scenario or in any other scenario, Jesus is being mocked. He pulls up his pain, his suffering, and everything, and he begins to pray for them. We're being mocked. Is that our reaction? Do we pull ourselves together through the pain, the hurt, the suffering, and say, I'm going to pray for that person? I'm going to pray that God forgives them, that God brings grace to them, that God restores them, that God gets them to his table? Or is our reaction to get angry and to fight and to defend and to do? I get angry, I fight, I defend. And that's just at home, let alone in the world. But what he's wanting us to do and to see in his life is that we can lay that aside and even to the last breath, pray and hope and believe for the salvation, the redemption of every person. Because the Bible says that he is not willing that any should perish, but that all should have everlasting life. This last slide is Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 13. I just want to challenge you to this. If the Last Supper is something that you want to honor, really want to honor, if the Last Supper is something that you really think is significant, that you care about, if it in any way causes you a distress or any kind of suffering that or offense that somebody else is mocking it or doing displays or doing whatever the case, if any of that bothers you and you have a true desire to honor it, then I'm going to challenge you to go read it. To go read through the 4 different gospel accounts of the Last Supper and the events immediately surrounding it. Because that's the best way to honor it.